King Darian Ashvale had not slept in 3 days. It was not unusual for him. Sleep was something other men needed. Men who did not carry kingdoms on their backs. Men who did not wake in the dark reaching for a sword that was already in their hand before their eyes were fully open. Darian was 34 years old, and had been Alpha King for 12 of those years. He had fought 6 wars, signed 9 treaties, and buried more soldiers than he could count, without feeling the weight of every single one. But tonight was different. Something pulled at him. Not a sound, not a message, not anything he could name. Just a pull, deep and quiet, like a hook behind his ribs. He stood at the window of his war tent at the northern border and stared into the darkness of the ruins beyond the tree line, and he could not explain why he could not look away. "Your Majesty." His second general, a broad man named Rowan, stepped beside him. "The patrol has cleared the ruins. Nothing there." "Go again," Darian said. Rowan paused. "Sir, the men have already—" "Go again." Rowan went. Darian pulled on his riding coat and followed before anyone could tell him not to. His wolves fell into position around him without being asked. 6 of his best, silent and fast. They moved through the tree line and into the ruins, where broken stone arches rose from the ground like the bones of something ancient. The wind was cold, the torches bent sideways. And then Darian heard it. Thin, fragile. A sound that had no business being in a place like this. He held up one fist, and every soldier behind him stopped. He walked forward alone, torch in hand, toward the hollow of a collapsed stone arch that sat at the far end of the ruins. He crouched down slowly. There was a baby, wrapped in a cloth that had once been white and was now stained deep red at the edges. Newborn. Small enough to fit in one of Darian's hands. Alive, barely, by the sound of it, but alive. The child's eyes were squeezed shut, mouth open, producing the most impossibly small cry Darian had ever heard. He stared at the child for a long moment. Then he picked him up. Back at the war tent, the sight of the Alpha King walking in carrying an infant caused a silence so complete that even the fire seemed to quiet down. Darian set the child on the examination table and turned to his physician. "Clean him, feed him, keep him warm. And then, Your Majesty," the physician asked carefully, "and then do it again." He stepped back and crossed his arms and watched from a distance as the baby was cleaned and wrapped in dry cloth and fed from a soaked piece of linen. A young soldier held the child awkwardly, like someone who had never held anything fragile before. The baby fussed, then settled. Then the child's eyes opened for the first time. Silver, almost glowing in the torchlight. The kind of pale, clear silver that Darian had only ever seen in very old portraits that hung in the deepest halls of the royal palace. His arms tightened across his chest. His jaw went tight. He said nothing, but he did not sleep at all that night. 2 days later, back at the palace, Darian stood in the medical chamber while his head physician completed a full examination of the child. He had told no one why. He had told no one what he suspected. He stood with his back to the wall and waited. The physician worked quietly, professionally, moving through the examination with steady hands. And then he stopped. He was looking at the child's left shoulder blade. He turned the baby slightly, held the torch closer, and went completely still. "What is it?" Darian said. It was not a question. The physician looked up slowly. His face had gone pale. "Your Majesty, this mark. Describe it." "It is beneath the skin, only visible in direct light." The physician swallowed. "It is crescent-shaped, layered. It matches." He stopped himself. "Say it." "It matches the royal blood seal, Your Majesty, the Ashvale mark, the one that only appears in those who carry direct lineage from the founding king." The room was very quiet. Darian walked forward, looked at the mark himself, and stood there for a moment that lasted much longer than it appeared to. Then he stepped back. "You saw nothing," he said quietly. The physician nodded once. "I saw nothing, Your Majesty." That night, alone in his chambers, Darian did not pace. Pacing was for men who were unsure. He stood at his window and thought with the same cold precision he used to plan military campaigns, laying out every fact like a map on a table. He had no children. He had no living siblings. His wife, Queen Lena, had died 3 years ago, taken by sudden illness, they had said. He had believed them because grief had made him willing to believe anything that did not require him to act. She had died without an heir. That was what everyone knew. But the child was newborn, not 3 years old, and the seal on that small shoulder was real. The dates, when he reconstructed them carefully, did not lead to a comfortable conclusion. They led to a very uncomfortable one. Someone had taken his wife before she died. Someone had known she was pregnant. Someone had hidden the child, not to destroy him, because the child was still alive, but to keep him away from something, or someone. And 3 years later, that someone had left the child, where only a king's instinct, not a court order, would bring him. His hands were very still at his sides. That was how Darian looked when he was the most dangerous. Commander Seraph said he knew nothing. He said it cleanly, with steady eyes, the way a man says something he has rehearsed. Darian had known Seraph for 15 years. He knew exactly what that steadiness meant. He dismissed Seraph without argument. He assigned 2 shadow wolves to follow him without announcement. 2 nights later, he called Seraph into the war room alone and placed a charcoal sketch on the table between them, a mark from the wrist of the intruder caught near the child's chamber the previous night. A burned circle, the mark of a noble faction everyone believed had been destroyed 5 years ago in the war. Seraph stared at it. Then, for the first time in 15 years, he lowered himself to one knee. What he said next changed the shape of everything. Queen Lena had not died of illness. She had been taken, quietly, carefully, by people within the court who understood that a direct royal heir would end their ability to control the succession. Seraph had found out too late to stop the taking. He had helped arrange her passage to the border territories, believing she would be safer outside palace walls. He had believed she would send word when it was over. She had not sent word because she had not survived the birth. But the child had. A trusted woman at the border had kept him alive. And Lena, who had known her own chances were uncertain, had designed everything, the location of the ruins, the specific ruins that sat outside noble jurisdiction, the ruins where a king's blood instinct, not a court document, would lead him, so that Darian would find his son himself. Seraph had waited too long to tell him. He had been afraid. He said it simply and without excuse, and Darian believed him, which somehow made it worse. Darian stood at the far end of the room for a long moment after Seraph finished. Then he said, very quietly, "Get out." He went to the child's room that night, without telling anyone. The nurse had been given leave for the evening. The room was dark and warm and quiet. The child, Darian had started calling him Kale in his own mind without noticing when it started, was awake, making small, unfocused sounds at the ceiling. Darian sat in the chair beside the crib. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, and looked at his son. He did not speak. He did not know what he would have said. He was a man built from war and distance, and the particular loneliness of power, and no amount of that had prepared him for this specific moment, in this specific dark room, with this specific small person, who had no idea what his existence had already cost, and what it was still going to cost before things were made right. When Kale's small hand reached through the bars of the crib and found Darian's finger in the dark, the Alpha King, who had not shown weakness in front of any living person in 11 years, let out a long, slow breath that carried the weight of all of them. He stayed for 2 hours. He did not let go of the finger. Lady Vessa moved when she felt the ground shifting beneath her. She called an emergency assembly of the noble court and challenged the king's declaration of Kale as a crown ward. Her argument was procedurally correct. A child of unverified origin could not be placed under royal protection without a formal bloodline tribunal. She spoke with perfect composure and a gracious smile, and the assembled nobles listened, because Vessa was the kind of person people listened to right up until they understood what she actually was. Darian sat on his throne and let her finish. Then he stood and said one word to the guard at the side door. Now. Elder Marin entered the chamber. She was ancient and unhurried, and she carried with her the specific authority of someone who does not need permission to be believed. She moved to the center of the room, asked for the child to be brought forward, and performed the bloodline rite in front of every noble present. The Ashvale seal rose on Kale's shoulder blade in gold light. It held for 30 full seconds. The chamber was completely silent. Vessa's smile, for the first time in anyone's memory, did not hold. Darien did not raise his voice during Vessa's arrest. He did not need to. He called the charges before the full court: conspiracy against the crown, collusion with a treasonous faction, and direct action against the life of a royal heir, and watched as the guards took her arms. She looked at him as they led her out and said, with something that sounded almost like genuine respect, that she had underestimated how far his instincts would carry him. He told her she had underestimated his blood. In the days that followed, the interrogations began to pull names out of the dark. The faction was larger than Darien had calculated. It reached across 3 allied kingdoms, into councils and courts and noble houses that had shaken his hand at formal dinners. The war he had believed was over turned out to have been a beginning he had misread as an ending. But before all of that, before the campaign he was already building in the back of his mind, there was one more thing. A letter had been delivered to him by a woman who had served his wife as a personal guard. She had waited until the child was safe before she surfaced. She had carried the letter for 3 years. Darien read it alone in his chambers, late at night, with no candle lit except one. The letter was in Lena's handwriting. It was not long. It was not dramatic or tearful. It was clear and direct, the way she had always been, the quality he had loved about her more than any other, because clarity had always felt to him like a form of kindness. She had known about the faction. She had known they would come for an heir. She had chosen to have the child in secret, and designed, specifically and carefully, for Darien to find his son through instinct rather than information. She had trusted his blood to call to the child's blood across distance and time. She had believed he would come. She had been right. The letter ended with 3 sentences. Darien read them. He closed the letter carefully and held it between both hands for a long moment. Then he set it on the desk beside the single candle and sat with it in the quiet for a while. A week later, on a clear afternoon, he stood on the palace balcony above the city. He was not a man who made public appearances for comfort or ceremony. When he appeared before his people, it was to deliver law, or to announce war, or to close something that needed to be formally closed. Today, he was there to open something. He held Cale in his arms. The child was awake, and deeply unbothered by the thousands of people gathered below, or the weight of the moment, or the gold light that still faintly marked his shoulder in the afternoon sun. Darien spoke clearly, without performance. He told his people that the child in his arms was his son, that the blood was confirmed, that the lineage was unbroken, that the heir they had believed lost had been found, not by court decree or political arrangement, but by the oldest law in their world, the law that said blood calls to blood, and a king who listens will always find his way to what belongs to him. He declared Cale Ashvale, the crown prince of the Ashvale kingdom. Below, the silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then the howling began. The deep, layered, rolling sound of pack recognition rising through the city in a wave that moved outward like water, building rather than fading, until it was all there was in every direction as far as sound could carry. Darien stood and let it wash over him. He looked down at his son. Cale looked back up at him with those serious silver eyes, reached up with one small hand, grabbed a fistful of the king's collar, and held on. Darien's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. Not yet, not fully, because he was Darien Ashvale, and full smiles were something he was going to have to relearn slowly and in private. But it was close. It was something that, if a person watched carefully at exactly the right moment, looked very much like the beginning of one. He covered the small hand with his own. He held on too,